Cape Cod Broadcasting weaves the listening environments of 99.9 WQRC, Ocean 104.7, WFCC Classical 107.5, Cape Country 104, and CapeCon.com's website experience to reflect the lifestyles of the people who live, work, and play on Cape Cod. We hope that you enjoy this podcast.
I'm Laura Reckford, and this is Sunday Journal. I'm here in the studio with Matthew Stackpole, the ship historian for the Charles W. Morgan Restoration, which is the last wooden whale ship in the world. Matthew, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Laura. Thanks for the chance.
Now, the home port for this ship is the Mystic Seaport, but it is traveling around New England this summer, and people can visit her and come on board. Is that right?
That's right. We're on what we're calling the 38th voyage of the Morgan, as she had 37 whaling voyages back in the 19th and 20th century. And we're traveling to multiple ports in New England, and people can come aboard. We're actually in New Bedford right now, and we'll be there until Sunday, and the ship is open to the public there. And then we're going to be in Provincetown. I'll talk about that a bit, and then on to Boston, where we'll tie up next to the Constitution, and the ship will be open to the public there as well. And then we're going to come back through the Cape Cod Canal later in July and be at the Mass Maritime Academy, where people will be able to come aboard and help us all celebrate the 100th centennial of the Cape Cod Canal.
Great. So lots of opportunities for people to visit the ship. And let's take a couple steps backwards and talk about first your background as a historian and your background in this region. Can you tell us a little about that?
Well, I was saying to people the other day, at one point I used to think I was raised, but I've now realized I was indoctrinated in the sense that my father, Edward Stackpole, was a maritime historian and who specialized in whaling, in fact, and I was born on Nantucket, where he was working with the Inquirer Mirror and was also the president of the Nantucket Historical. And in the 50s, remember the 50s? He had a Guggenheim Fellowship and wrote a book called The Sea Hunters, which was a definitive history of American whaling. And because of that, he was hired at Mystic Seaport to be the curator at Mystic, as Mystic had the Charles W. Morgan, the last whale ship left in the world, which had arrived there in 1941. And Dad was the head of the curator at Mystic from 1953 until 1966, when he went back to Nantucket. So I grew up first on Nantucket and then at Mystic with hearing about whaling all the time and meeting all these remarkable people who were connected to it, who were historians or world explorers, and it really has been a part of my life for a long time. I became a school teacher and taught history, and eventually have made my way through a variety of channels to becoming a historian and being involved in this story. Ended up being the director of the Martha's Vineyard Museum for 8 years before, in 2008, returning to Mystic to join this remarkable restoration that's been quite a journey, and here we are.
So a long history in the region and a long time sort of multi-generational historian here. And so let's start talking about the boat. It's just a magnificent vessel. It's designated a National Historic Landmark. Describe it for the people.
Well, she's a classic American whale ship, and she is a National Historic Landmark. She's the oldest American merchant ship still afloat, as well as being the only whale ship left in the world. She was built in 1841 in New Bedford at the Hillman Brothers Shipyard, and she represents the pinnacle of the design of whale ships. 150 years really of experience led into her. So she's 105 feet 6 inches on deck, 135 feet overall from the end of her jib boom to the end of her spanker boom. She's 27 and a half feet wide, and she has the capacity of being home for 32 to 35 sailors and being able also to carry 90,000 gallons of oil. So she was a function-driven design, again, based on all of these years and years of experience, and she represents the pinnacle of that design. She was also, and this is exciting for us because we're sailing her again, she made 37 voyages to every ocean of the world. And until about 2.5 weeks ago, nobody alive had sailed on a whale ship until we started sailing again. And it's wonderful to hear the crew talk about her sailing ability. She can carry 13,000 square feet of sail. Her main truck on her main mast is 113 feet above the water. She has 3 masts. She's what's called a bark, which means she's square-rigged on the foremast and the mainmast, but is fore and aft rigged on her mizzen. And just a very, of course, no engine, a remarkable American vessel.
The sails are so beautiful. I mean, I think that's the first thing you notice when you see her. Can you talk a little bit about the sails?
Well, she's square-rigged, and those sails are all brand new. They were built for us by Nat Wilson up in East Booth Bay, Maine, who is one of the great sailmakers in America. He actually worked on the Coast Guard Bark Eagle and early on, and then he worked at a place called Mystic Seaport in the sail off there in the 1970s. But he understands square rig. Square rig is literally that. It means the sails are square, and these were the type of sails that were on the great clipper ships and the merchant ships, the transatlantic ships, as well as the whale ships back in the 18th and 19th century. Not a huge demand for them these days, although more than there was 50 or 60 years ago. Nat made a mizzen topsail for the Constitution, for example, when she went sailing. But the sails, and they're, by the way, they're cotton. The restoration has been focused on being as authentic as we could to the original, and these are really wonderful, beautiful white cotton sails.
I was wondering about that, whether they used the original materials. Now, who was Charles Morgan, the boat's namesake?
Charles W. Morgan was the principal owner of the whale ship, and that meant that he owned more than 50% of it. Whale ships, whaling was an industry that America pursued for over 200 years, first as a colony and then as a nation. And it's the first industry that we, again as a colony and then as a nation, dominated internationally. And the way it was capitalized, if you will, is that there were investors in the ship who were the owners. And Charles W. Morgan owned, as I say, half of the Morgan, and so the ship was named after him.
Now, they call her a lucky ship. Why is that? Explain that term.
Well, she's lucky, first of all, because she still exists today. There were, in those 200 years of whaling I talked about, there were just over 2,700 ships that sailed on 14,864 documented voyages. We know that because of a wonderful book by Judy Lund, the great historian at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. She sailed on 37 voyages, just to give you a sense of the scale of this industry, and she's the last one left. She survived 37 voyages to every ocean of the world, which meant she survived uncharted waters. She was in any number of storms, hurricanes, typhoons. Sounds like we may have a little bit of a weather this weekend, in fact. But she sailed through all of that around the Horn multiple times. She survived fire at sea. There was a small mutiny at one point in her history. But she's always made it back and survived. As my daughter Kate likes to say, when we sailed into New Bedford Harbor, behind her was a ghost fleet of 2,700 vessels. She's the last one to tell the story of that whole industry. And certainly part of her luck was first being saved by Colonel Edward Howland Robinson Greene in New Bedford in 1925-26 when he took her to his estate at Round Hill. And then in 1941, when she came up the Mystic River, November 8th, less than 30 days before Pearl Harbor, finding a safe harbor, if you will, up the Mystic River, that made her a lucky ship. And she's lucky enough now to have been restored to sailing condition and be underway again. I like to say we've restored her and resurrected her as she's alive again.
The others all ended up in the scrap heap, I guess, the other 2,700.
Well, it's interesting. Again, the story of American whaling reflects the history of the nation, and certainly some were lost at sea in storms. Some were lost because of wrecking. Some were just lost after a long life. There were over 30 that were trapped in the Arctic ice in 1871 and crushed by the ice. Well over 30 were sunk intentionally by the Northern government during the Civil War, trying to blockade the ports of Savannah and Charlestown. So there were multiple. A lot of them were abandoned in San Francisco when the gold rush started. All the sailors went ashore, decided it was better to dig for gold than to chase whales up into all the ocean. So she's lucky because she made it through all of those things. Many
different fates for all of these ships, and I believe her last whaling trip was relatively late in the game for the whaling industry.
Yeah,
is that right?
She ended her last trip was ended in May of 1921, and it's interesting. in that she started in the 1840s, literally in the 1840s and 1850s were the busiest and most profitable of American whaling under sail. And she, in fact, sailed literally to the end of the industry. So that was her journey, if you will, over her lifetime.
I'm Laura Reckford, and this is Sunday Journal. I'm talking with historian Matthew Stackpole about the last whaling ship, the Charles W. Morgan. And let's talk about the preservation of the ship. Obviously, you've been very involved in that. And what has that entailed over the years?
Well, one of the great things about wooden ships, or maybe one of the bad things about wooden ships too, is that they're infinitely renewable. And so that as long as you keep replacing the wood, they carry on. And that's been the story with the Morgan and any wooden vessel that you own. She was rebuilt from the waterline up literally 40 years into her life in the 1880s in Fairhaven and New Bedford. And once she got to Mystic, she was retopped again from the waterline up in the 50s and then again in the 80s. But Mystic, in fact, has the Henry B. DuPont Preservation Shipyard. It's the only shipyard in the nation whose sole purpose is to restore and maintain historic vessels. And so in November of 2008, we hauled the Morgan out and began restoring her from the waterline down, which had not been done literally since she was built, so that when we took the interior apart, and the waterline is just what it sounds like, when we took the interior apart, we were looking at the original work that had been done in 1841. Nobody had seen it since 1841. And nobody will ever see it again. So we turned the whole project into an archaeological dig, as we photographed and measured and 3D laser scanned every detail. Just humbling to see the work that had been done. And think of it, the folks who did that work in 1841 could never have imagined that the ship would still be alive in 2008. And replacing those original frames, which are called futtocks, it's 17 and a half feet from the waterline down to the keel and keelson in the ship. And there's no one piece of wood big enough to do that. So it's done in sections of 3, and those sections are called futtocks. And so we replaced 280 of the original futtocks with live oak that was secured ironically, from the hurricanes Hugo, Ike, and Katrina, which laid waste to many of those trees down that's the southern wood, grows along the Gulf. Incredibly strong, incredibly dense, incredibly hard to work with because the grain is so tough, but very, very strong. And then we replaced 75 interior planks, which we did with longleaf yellow pine, also hard to get, but we have some sources in Virginia. As this wood, the planking is 3.5 inches thick, and some of the 15 inches high, and some of the longest ones about 40 to 45 feet long. So the size of it made it hard to get. We also had white oak that we used on the bow and stern of the ship, and both on the inside and the outside. We used yellow pine on the exterior planking too. We replaced 175 exterior planks. And so getting that wood was really quite a challenge. And there's actually, we talk about her being a lucky ship, there's another miracle that happened to her. In 2010, Walsh Brothers Construction in Boston was beginning the construction of what is now the remarkable Spaulding Rehabilitation Hospital at the old Navy Yard in Charlestown. And they literally came across a forgotten timber basin in which, in the 19th century, the Navy had purchased wood for ships like the Constitution and preserved it by putting it in these timber basins, which were filled with salt water. Salt water is the friend of wood. Fresh water is what causes rot. And so that was a traditional way to maintain the wood. It was covered up in 1910 and forgotten. And in 2010, when they were doing this digging, they came across this timber basin. And Walsh Brothers and Partners Healthcare donated 17 truckloads of live oak and white oak. That was the finest wood that we got. It had been cut in the 19th century by people who had been building wooden vessels their entire lives, knew what they were looking for, had the money to get the best wood, and almost every single piece of that wood went into the ship too. So it was a gift from the past to the future, as I like to say, history helping history. An
amazing find, and people who go visit the boat can, of course, look inside and see some of this work that you've done. Is that right?
Yeah, they can. They can see particularly tween decks, and they can see see the exterior of the ship. It's one of the lower hold is backfilled with stuff, so they can't see all the work we did as it's now been reconstructed. But we have lots of documentary evidence of that, and people can see film of it, and you can look in to see part of it, and you see the exterior hull, which certainly has all of that planking on it and in the water. So it's pretty remarkable to see it. Its use has been proven to be the warranty's working out. She's doing a great job as a sailing vessel.
And one of the main purposes of the boat is education. Is that right? So you really want to tell people about not just the history of whaling, the history of this remarkable boat, but also the restoration and so forth.
We do. We say that her cargo today is history, and one of the reasons to care about history is not to be nostalgic. It's because history should be useful to today and to tomorrow. And as I mentioned earlier, she does represent 200 years of American history. I mean, her reason for being was that before electricity, before kerosene, before oil, there was a need to light the world. And starting in the early 1700s, whale ships from New England started doing that. And New England and, in fact, Massachusetts dominated that industry for the rest of the time, both domestically and internationally. And so, they went to all these oceans of the world in search of whales because the whale oil was used to light the world. Ironically, the capital that was generated by whaling went into the whole growth of the American economy. At one point, it represented 20% of the GNP of the nation. So the money just didn't flow back into whaling. It flowed into the Industrial Revolution, into westward expansion, into the railroads, into new technologies that were developed. And so that it ended up the oil that was generated through whaling as we get into the middle part of the 19th century is both lubricating the Industrial Revolution as well as providing capital for it. But there are other parts of the story that are important to remember. Exploration and discovery, absolutely, around the world. The whole question about the quest for energy and what do you do to respond to the great demand for energy, still a relevant question today. What about the impact that we can have on the world around us, on the oceans, on the air? I can say with some certainty that most people in the 19th century couldn't imagine that that whales or anything in the ocean were finite. We certainly know today that that's not the case. So what lessons can we take from that? And so we're hoping that the Morgan's voyage, this 38th voyage, is a voyage of discovery, looking back into the past to take some valuable lessons from it, but also being inspired to think today about what we're doing and recognize, certainly in terms of whales, all the great work that's been done to try to protect and preserve whales. A lot of that right here in Massachusetts, certainly in Provincetown and the wonderful Provincetown Center for Coastal Studies and NOAA and their underwater sanctuary. So a lot of relevant things. That's the exciting part of the voyage. It's dramatic, and we really believe it will be useful.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. I've been talking with historian Matthew Stackpole about the Charles W. Morgan, the last whaling vessel. I'm Laura Reckford, and this is Sunday Journal.
This podcast is a presentation of Cape Cod Broadcasting, which is solely responsible for its content. Thank you for listening. For more information, please visit us at capecodbroadcasting.com.